The quiet hum of the restaurant, the clinking of silverware, and the soft murmur of voices filled the air. It seemed like just another evening, like any other dinner service at the upscale bistro. But little did anyone know, tonight was about to take a shocking turn that no one would ever forget. It all started with a woman sitting alone at a table by the window. Dressed sharply, she looked like someone who was used to the finer things in life, someone who prided herself on always getting what she wanted. Her eyes scanned the menu as she absent-mindedly tapped her fingers on the table, waiting for someone to take her order. But the moment the waiter appeared, something in the air shifted. He wasn't what she expected. In fact, he wasn't anything like she thought he would be. She looked him up and down, a faint smirk forming on her lips, as if she had already judged him the second he approached. His uniform was neat, his demeanor calm, but there was something in her eyes, something sharp that made him hesitate. And that hesitation would prove to be the beginning of a confrontation neither of them saw coming. "You're the one taking my order?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension, her gaze lingering a little too long on his skin. Her words hung in the air, thick with judgment. She might as well have said, "You don't belong here." There was a coldness in her tone that made it clear she didn't think much of him. It wasn't just a simple remark, it was a challenge, a test, to see how he would respond. The waiter's face remained composed, but inside, his heart raced. He'd been working in this restaurant for years, dealing with all kinds of people, but something about this woman felt different. There was a cruelty in her voice, a harshness that was hard to ignore. He had a job to do, and he wasn't going to let her words get to him, but deep down, he knew this was no ordinary customer. "Is there a problem?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he could see her posture stiffen. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips twisted into something between a sneer and a smile. "Oh, I don't know," she said slowly, as though toying with him. "I just expected a little more. I guess I didn't realize they let people like you work here." The weight of her words slammed into him like a physical blow. For a moment, everything around him seemed to fade, the clatter of dishes, the chatter of other diners. All he could hear was the ringing of her judgment. But it was more than just her words that stung. It was the look in her eyes, the sheer arrogance, the assumption that he didn't belong in this space. She was daring him to say something, to react. And for a brief, terrifying moment, he thought about walking away, about letting her have her moment of superiority. But something inside him refused to let that happen. He took a deep breath, his hands steady, his eyes locked with hers. He wasn't about to let this go. Not this time. "I'm just here to take your order," he said, the calm in his voice masking the tension building inside. "If there's a problem, we can get the manager." He turned slightly, ready to move on, but then she spoke again, her voice sharp and unyielding. "Oh, I'm sure the manager would love to know who's working here tonight. Do they know that a person like you is serving customers?" "How interesting." The waiter froze, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy cloak. She wasn't just disrespecting him, she was daring him to defend himself, to challenge her. It was a test he hadn't asked for, but one he knew he couldn't back down from. What she didn't know was that he wasn't just some passive worker. He had a voice, he had his dignity, and he wasn't about to let anyone strip him of that, not even her. But as he prepared to respond, something unexpected happened. The restaurant manager, who had been quietly observing from the back, made his way toward the table. He was a large man with a no-nonsense demeanor, and he was well known for handling difficult customers with an unwavering calm. "Is there a problem here?" the manager asked, his gaze moving between the woman and the waiter. The tension in the air was palpable. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. The woman's eyes flickered toward the manager, and then back at the waiter. She opened her mouth to say something, but her words caught in her throat. The silence stretched on, and the woman's smug confidence began to falter, just a little. She wasn't expecting this. She wasn't expecting anyone to stand up to her. Her usual tactics had always worked before, intimidating, belittling, and bullying her way through the world. But now, she wasn't so sure. She had made her judgment. She had thought she could control the situation. But as the seconds ticked by, she realized her assumptions were about to be shattered. The manager, watching her closely, said nothing more, allowing her discomfort to build. The woman's eyes darted between the waiter and the manager, a flicker of uncertainty passing through her. She opened her mouth, but then closed it again. Something was changing. The power dynamic she thought she controlled was slipping away. What would she do now? Would she back down, or would she double down on her arrogance? Would she realize the depth of her mistake, or would her pride force her to dig in deeper, no matter the cost? As the woman sat there, the silence between them hanging heavy, the outcome of this confrontation was still uncertain. But one thing was clear: this wasn't just about a simple disagreement over an order. This was about respect, about power, and about the consequences of underestimating someone based on their appearance. And in that moment, everything was about to change. The stage was set for a reckoning, but would it come swiftly or slowly? Would the woman regret her words, or would she cling to her prejudices, refusing to accept the truth? Whatever happened next, it was clear that nothing was going to be the same for her again. Stay tuned, because this story is just beginning. And the regret she would feel? It would come faster than she could ever imagine. The restaurant was filled with an uneasy quiet now, broken only by the occasional clink of a glass or the distant murmur of other diners. The manager, who had been silently observing the scene unfold, kept his gaze steady on the woman sitting at the table. His presence was commanding, and it wasn't hard to tell that he wasn't intimidated by her, unlike the waiter, who was still standing near the table, his hands slightly trembling as he waited for what would happen next. The woman shifted in her seat, her eyes flicking to the manager, then back to the waiter. There was something in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there moments ago when she had looked down on him with disdain. Was it uncertainty? Or maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to realize that her words were having the opposite effect of what she intended. Her eyes narrowed as she searched the manager's face, looking for any sign that he might take her side. But to her growing frustration, he showed no such inclination. Instead, the manager's expression remained neutral, like someone used to handling difficult situations, someone who had seen it all before. The waiter, still standing stiffly at attention, was now trying to control the growing knot in his stomach. He'd dealt with rude customers before, but this was different. There was an edge to her tone, a coldness that seemed to slice through the air. And as much as he wanted to push back, to tell her exactly what he thought of her condescending attitude, he knew better. The restaurant had rules, and he was here to do his job. But at the same time, something in him simmered. He had been pushed around before, by people who thought they were superior, by people who thought that his worth was defined by the job he did. Tonight was supposed to be just another night at work, but the woman at the table was making it something far more personal. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, though in reality it had only been a minute or two. The woman finally broke it, her voice sharp and laced with irritation. "Well, is this how your establishment handles things? You let a person like him serve your customers, and you think that's acceptable?" The manager didn't flinch. He was used to this kind of behavior, the kind that came from people who thought their money or their status could buy them respect. "Ma'am, we don't tolerate disrespect here. If you have a concern with your service, you're welcome to speak to me. But the way you've spoken to my staff is unacceptable." Her lips curled into a tight smile, but it wasn't the kind of smile that suggested amusement. It was the kind of smile someone wears when they think they still have control of the situation, even when it's slipping through their fingers. "Unacceptable, huh?" she repeated, almost mocking. You think I'm the one being disrespectful? How cute. I think he is the one who should be grateful he has a job here. The waiter could feel the tension building between them. It was like an invisible force in the air, pulling tighter with every passing second. The manager stood firm, not backing down, but the woman was relentless. Meanwhile, the waiter's mind raced, his thoughts swirling in frustration. How could someone like her say these things so freely, so confidently, without any regard for how hurtful they were? It wasn't just that she had insulted him, it was the way she had assumed her position was above his, as though he was beneath her, just because of his skin color. His fingers clenched into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to remain calm, to keep his composure. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now. The woman's eyes flicked to the waiter once again, lingering for a moment too long. Her gaze was cold, calculating, as if she was sizing him up for something more than just an interaction between a customer and a waiter. The longer she looked at him, the more he could feel the weight of her scrutiny, like she was trying to strip him of everything that made him who he was. But it wasn't just him that she was sizing up, it was the entire situation. The power dynamic, the expectations, the lines that she thought were clearly drawn. And in her mind, she was on top. "Tell me," she said, her voice dropping to a quieter, almost venomous tone. "Why don't you just go back to where you came from, where people like you belong?" Her words were laced with an ugliness that went beyond simple ignorance. It was a comment that carried years of deep-seated prejudice, one that cut through the air like a blade. For a moment, the waiter didn't speak. His mind was reeling, unable to process the audacity of her words. He wanted to shout, to tell her exactly what he thought of her and her disgusting assumptions. But he knew if he did, it would only give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. The manager, however, had had enough. His voice was low and controlled, but there was an edge to it now. "That's enough," he said, his gaze now fully on the woman. "We don't tolerate that kind of talk here. If you're not happy with the service, I'll be happy to show you to the door. But if you continue to disrespect my staff, you'll be asked to leave immediately." The woman's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise flashing across her face. She hadn't expected this level of resistance, especially not from a place like this. For a moment, she seemed to falter, unsure of what to do next. She had grown accustomed to people backing down when she made her demands, to people simply accepting her superiority. But this was different. The manager wasn't backing down. Neither was the waiter. It was a moment that, for the woman, felt like a turning point. She could feel her power slipping away, the control she had once wielded over the situation crumbling. She opened her mouth to say something, but then, unexpectedly, she closed it again. The words that had been on the tip of her tongue seemed to fade away, replaced by a discomfort she hadn't anticipated. She had pushed too far. The waiter could sense it. He could see the shift in her demeanor, the way her posture had subtly changed. There was still an air of arrogance about her, but it was beginning to unravel. She was no longer the confident, superior woman who had walked into the restaurant moments ago. She was starting to feel the weight of the consequences of her words, the truth of her own ignorance slowly sinking in. The manager stood silently, watching her, waiting for her response. The tension in the air was thick, almost unbearable. What would she do now? Would she apologize, realizing the mistake she had made? Or would she double down, refusing to acknowledge the hurt she had caused, convinced that she was still in control? For a brief moment, it seemed like the answer would be obvious. But then, the woman surprised them both. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and without another word, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the restaurant. The door swung shut behind her with a sharp, final sound, leaving an echo of emptiness in its wake. The manager and the waiter stood there for a moment, silent. The tension in the room slowly began to dissipate, but the unease lingered. What had just happened? Had she truly realized the weight of her words? Or had she simply retreated, unwilling to face the truth? As the door clicked shut, the waiter's breath slowly exhaled. He hadn't realized until now how tightly he had been holding onto that breath, waiting for her to make a move. Now, he was left standing there, wondering what the true cost of her words would be. Would there be consequences beyond this moment? Would she return, or would this be the end of the story? Only time would tell. The silence that filled the restaurant after the woman stormed out was almost suffocating. The waiter stood still for a moment, processing what had just happened. He felt the weight of the tension in the air, thick and heavy, but it wasn't just the encounter with her that lingered. It was the unspoken reality of the situation, the deep-rooted prejudice, the assumption that just because he was serving her, he was somehow beneath her. That sting had settled deep within him, like an ember waiting to ignite, but he couldn't afford to give it that satisfaction. Not here, not now. The manager gave him a knowing glance but said nothing. There was nothing to say. The woman had left, and her words had hung in the air long enough to leave an uncomfortable residue. The waiter turned back to the service station, feeling the burn of the woman's words lingering on his skin, his heart still racing. He tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but his mind kept drifting back to the confrontation, back to how he felt powerless, yet defiant. It was like she had taken something from him, but maybe, just maybe, it wasn't hers to take in the first place. Meanwhile, in the parking lot, the woman's anger boiled over. She slammed her car door with force, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she sat in the driver's seat, breathing heavily. The moment she'd left the restaurant, a rush of emotions surged through her: embarrassment, disbelief, frustration. How had it gotten so out of hand? She had been in control. She always was. But now, she was shaken. No one had ever dared to stand up to her the way they had tonight, not like that. And she hated it. She hated that she hadn't been able to manipulate the situation, to push those around her back into the roles she believed they belonged in. The waiter, the manager, all of them had been a reflection of something she couldn't quite understand. Her mind raced. What had gone wrong? She had expected the waiter to back down, to apologize, to defer to her. Instead, he had stood his ground. And the manager, he hadn't even flinched. It was as though they were both playing by a set of rules she didn't understand, and that terrified her. The power she had felt at first, the superiority, the privilege, was slipping away, and she didn't know how to stop it. As the minutes passed, her anger simmered into something else, something darker, more insidious. A gnawing feeling crept up inside her, slowly gnawing at her confidence. Had she really been in the right? Could her words have been so harmful? She pushed those thoughts aside quickly, unwilling to entertain them for long. The truth, she told herself, was that she had been right all along. She had every right to demand what she wanted, and everyone else should just know their place. But something about the way the waiter had looked at her, the way the manager had confronted her, it was making her question everything, just a little bit. The next day, she couldn't shake the image of his face. The waiter's calm demeanor in the face of her tirade was still haunting her. How could he have been so composed? So unshaken? She had expected him to cower, to apologize for his very existence, but instead, she had been the one who had backed down. And now, the question was eating at her: why had she felt so entitled? What had given her the right to treat someone like that? At the restaurant, the day had passed slowly. The waiter had returned to work, but the encounter from the night before still hung over him. He had kept his head down, trying to avoid the eyes of his coworkers, trying to ignore the whispers that seemed to follow him in the break room. There was something about the way people looked at him that day, something different, as if they were wondering if he was okay, if he had been hurt. But no one asked directly. They didn't need to. The truth was, he wasn't sure what had hurt more, the woman's words, or the fact that he had been made to feel so small by someone he didn't even know. It wasn't just about her, this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a reflection of something much deeper, something ingrained in the very fabric of society. He had dealt with similar situations before, subtle racism masked in polite words, microaggressions disguised as small talk. But this was different. This woman had openly challenged him, had openly tried to diminish him because of something he couldn't change. And that had cut deeper than he cared to admit. The hours dragged on, and the waiter found himself distracted. He couldn't focus on the customers, couldn't keep his attention on the orders. Every time he looked up, he saw the woman's face, the sneer in her eyes. He couldn't forget it. And in the back of his mind, he wondered if it was the last time he would ever face such blatant hatred. But then he reminded himself, this wasn't about her. It was about how he stood his ground, how he had refused to back down. That had to count for something, didn't it? The manager, too, was unsettled by the incident. He had handled situations like this before, but something about this particular confrontation had left him uneasy. He had watched the waiter closely during the exchange, noticing the way he held his composure. He had expected him to snap, to lash out, to let the woman's words land where they might, but instead, the waiter had kept his cool. And that, in itself, was remarkable. The manager had been proud of him in that moment, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play here. He knew that the waiter wasn't the kind of person who let things slide easily. He was strong, but this wasn't something that would just go away. The manager had seen the subtle pain in his eyes when he'd walked away from the table, seen the way his shoulders had sagged just a little, like he was carrying the weight of the world on them. There was more to this than just a rude customer. This was about the bigger picture, the systemic inequality, the subtle yet unshakable divide between those who had power and those who didn't. The manager knew this wasn't the first time the waiter had experienced racism, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But how much could one person take before it broke them? How much more would they endure before they started to question their own worth? Later that evening, after the restaurant had quieted down and the last of the patrons had left, the waiter stood at the back door, looking out into the dark. The night air was cold, and the stars seemed far away, distant. His thoughts were a swirl of confusion, frustration, and if he was honest with himself, a deep, unsettling fear. He was terrified of the world outside, of the people who walked through the door every day with their assumptions, their prejudice, their hatred. He had been given a taste of what that world could look like, and it wasn't something he could easily forget. He wasn't sure where to go from here, or how to face tomorrow. But one thing was certain, this confrontation wasn't over. It couldn't be. Not for him. Not after everything that had happened. As he stood there, deep in thought, a small part of him wondered if the woman had regretted her actions, if she was feeling any of the same unease he was. But he quickly pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. She was gone now, and whatever she was feeling wouldn't change the way he felt. It wouldn't undo the damage she'd done. The night stretched on, and the questions remained unanswered. Would this situation escalate, or would it die down as quickly as it had started? Would the woman return, or had she fled into the night, never to be heard from again? And what about the waiter? Would he confront his own fear, or let it consume him? Whatever happened next, one thing was clear: either of them could escape the consequences of their actions forever. The story was far from over, and the unresolved tension lingered in the air, hanging over them like a storm waiting to break. The days following the confrontation felt like a slow burn, a tension that never quite dissipated, lingering in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't fully died out. The waiter arrived for his shift each day, going through the motions, but something had shifted within him. He couldn't shake the memory of that woman's face, the way her words had felt like a slap, her gaze cutting him down to his core. He told himself to let it go, to focus on his job, but it was impossible. Every time a customer came in, every time he refilled a drink or took an order, he felt like he was being watched. Not by the guests, but by something deeper within himself, something raw and unspoken. The manager noticed the change. The waiter was quieter now, more withdrawn. There was a certain edge to him that hadn't been there before, a distant look in his eyes that made the manager worry. He couldn't help but wonder if the waiter was thinking about the woman's words, wondering whether he had done enough to stand up for himself. And there was the fear, the subtle tension that had grown in the way the waiter moved, in the way he spoke, in the way he held himself. The manager knew the impact of those words wasn't something that would disappear easily. He had seen it in people before, how a single encounter could fracture something deep inside, leaving scars that might never fully heal. And then, just as the manager was beginning to think that maybe it was all behind them, the woman returned. It happened on a busy Friday evening, one of the restaurant's peak hours. The place was full, the hum of conversations mixing with the clink of silverware and glasses. The waiter was navigating his way through the crowd, his hands steady as he carried drinks to a table when he saw her. She had walked through the door as if nothing had happened, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on him. She didn't even hesitate. Without a moment's pause, she walked straight toward him, a smile on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. The waiter froze. His heart slammed in his chest as he stood rooted to the spot, feeling the familiar heat rise in his cheeks. His breath caught in his throat, and for a split second, everything around him seemed to fade. The bustling restaurant, the noise of the crowd, it was all gone. It was just her. Just the woman who had humiliated him. And he wasn't sure what to expect next. The woman approached him with an air of confidence, almost as if she had been here before, as if the incident hadn't happened at all. "I'm back," she said, her voice light, almost cheerful. But there was something sharp underneath, a hint of arrogance in the way she spoke, as if she expected everything to return to normal. The waiter swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. He forced a smile, one that didn't quite match the tension in his chest. He tried to keep his voice steady, but there was a slight quiver in it as he replied, "Welcome back. How can I help you today?" Her smile widened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'd like a table, please. Near the window." He nodded and motioned toward a nearby table, but she didn't move. Instead, she stepped closer to him, lowering her voice, just enough so only he could hear. "You know," she began, her words soft but carrying an edge, "I didn't expect to see you here again." Her eyes flicked over him, sizing him up, as if she were measuring him for something more than just a waiter. "But I suppose we all have to make a living somehow." The words hit him like a slap, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. His mind raced, the emotions from that night crashing over him like a tidal wave. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat was tight, the anger he had been holding back for days threatening to spill out. He clenched his jaw, trying to keep it together. But she wasn't done. "You know," she continued, leaning in just a little closer, "I wasn't wrong, was I? You're just a service worker. That's your place, right?" The words were soft, but there was venom behind them, a quiet cruelty that made his stomach churn. The manager, who had been watching from across the room, caught sight of the interaction. His eyes narrowed as he saw the woman's posture, her subtle but unmistakable attempt to undermine the waiter again. Something inside him snapped. He couldn't stand by and watch this happen again. He pushed his way through the crowd, making his way toward the table. The waiter, feeling the manager's presence behind him, managed to compose himself, even though his hands were shaking. His mind screamed at him to react, to confront her, to let her know that he wouldn't stand for this. But a part of him was terrified. Terrified of what would happen if he let the anger take over. Terrified that if he said the wrong thing, it might escalate beyond repair. As the manager approached, the woman turned toward him with a smile, trying to regain some semblance of control. I was just asking him a few questions, she said, her voice sweet and falsely innocent. But the manager saw through it immediately. Ma'am, I think it's time you left, he said firmly, his tone unyielding. There was no room for negotiation, no room for her to twist the situation. We don't tolerate that kind of behavior in this restaurant. The woman's eyes flicked to him, narrowing as she realized the manager wasn't going to back down. Her smile faltered, just for a second, but then she straightened up, her voice colder than before. You're making a mistake, she said, but there was a tremor in her voice now, a crack that wasn't there before. I'm a paying customer. You can't just. I don't care who you are, the manager interrupted, his voice stern. You don't get to treat anyone like that, not in here. Now, please leave. For a moment, the woman hesitated, her face contorting as if she were about to argue. But then, something seemed to snap inside her. She didn't say anything else. She just turned and walked out of the restaurant, her heels clicking against the floor with an unsettling finality. The door swung closed behind her, and the entire restaurant seemed to exhale collectively, as if holding its breath had finally come to an end. The waiter stood there for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe it had happened. She was gone. But the weight of the past few days of everything that had led up to this moment still clung to him like a shadow. The manager placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the ordeal they had just witnessed. But the waiter didn't look at him. Instead, he gazed toward the door where the woman had just left, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. Had she learned anything? Had she realized the harm she had caused? Or would she just walk away, unchanged, untouched by the events that had unfolded? He couldn't know. Not yet. All he could do was breathe, the tension in the air still hanging heavily around them. He had stood his ground. But would this be the end of the story? Or had this only been the beginning of something bigger? The door clicked shut behind the woman with an unsettling finality, and for a moment, the restaurant felt like a different place, quieter, calmer. The waiter stood there, his chest still tight, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what had just happened. It had been the confrontation he'd feared, the one that seemed so inevitable. But it was over, right? She had left. He had stood his ground, and the manager had backed him up. It was over. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling lingered in the back of his mind, one that refused to fade. He couldn't shake the thought that there was more to the story, that somehow, it wasn't finished. Maybe it was because of how easily the woman had left. Maybe it was the way she'd glanced back as she walked out. Something in her eyes told him this wasn't the end. Something had shifted, but he couldn't place what. He tried to focus on his work. The orders came in, the tables needed clearing, the customers were still there, laughing and chatting, oblivious to what had just unfolded. But his mind was elsewhere. Every time the door opened, he braced himself, half expecting the woman to storm back in, ready to resume her attack. But she didn't return. It was only when the restaurant started to empty out for the night that he felt the buzz in the air, like an electrical charge right before a storm. He stood by the service station, wiping down some menus when the manager called him over. Hey, can you step into the office for a minute? The manager asked, his voice unusually low. The waiter nodded, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling rising in his chest. He followed the manager to the back, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. When they stepped into the small office, the manager closed the door behind them, his face serious. I've been thinking, the manager began, rubbing his temples. I don't know if we're done with her yet. The waiter frowned. What do you mean? The manager hesitated for a moment, then pulled out his phone and showed the waiter a message. It was from the woman, the one who had just stormed out of the restaurant. I don't know if this is a joke, the manager said, his voice tight, but she sent me this right after she left. The message on the phone read, "You'll regret this. I'm not the only one who can make things difficult for you. You'll see what happens next." The words hit the waiter like a slap. He stared at the screen, the unease in his gut growing sharper. What did she mean by that? What kind of threat was this? The woman had left in anger, but now it seemed like she had something else planned, something that wasn't over by just walking out of the restaurant. The waiter's heart raced. Had she been planning this all along? Was this part of something bigger? The manager was already typing a response, his fingers moving quickly. "I'm telling her to keep it professional, but we need to be cautious," he said, his voice tense. "She's not just a random customer. Her tone. It doesn't sit right with me." The waiter nodded, trying to shake the knot forming in his stomach. It wasn't just about the woman anymore. It felt like there was something behind her, something far larger than one difficult customer. He had a sense that the situation had just escalated to a level that he hadn't even begun to understand. The tension between them was thick. Neither of them spoke for a moment, both of them contemplating what this message could mean. The waiter felt a chill run down his spine. Could she really do something? Could she cause trouble, bring more people into this? The possibility loomed like a dark cloud overhead, waiting to burst. The manager's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification of a review. He opened it with a sigh, and his face immediately went pale. "It's from her," he muttered, his voice shaking slightly. The waiter looked over his shoulder at the screen. The review was scathing, full of insults, personal attacks, and exaggerated complaints. It was one of those reviews meant to hurt, to damage, to make sure others saw her version of things. Her words were carefully chosen, laced with venom, and painted a picture of the restaurant as being unprofessional, with a racist waiter and a manager who allowed mistreatment. "This is bad," the manager said, his hand shaking as he set the phone down on the desk. "This could cause problems. We can't just ignore this." The waiter felt his heart rate spike. He had always known that a situation like this could spiral out of control, but seeing the review, seeing it in black and white, made it all the more real. She wasn't just some angry customer. She was wielding a weapon. And it wasn't just the waiter who would feel the consequences. This was about the whole restaurant now. About their reputation, about everything they had worked for. "Do you think she'll escalate this further?" the waiter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He had a sense that this was just the beginning. The manager took a deep breath, clearly concerned. "I don't know, but I've dealt with situations like this before. When someone with that kind of attitude takes it to the next level, it doesn't stop at a bad review. She's got a lot of power in her hands. And she's clearly not afraid to use it." Just as the tension in the room reached a peak, the phone buzzed again. The waiter's heart skipped a beat as he saw the name that popped up on the screen, her name. The woman had texted him directly. His hand hovered over the phone, unsure of what to do. His gut told him to ignore it, let her have the last word and move on. But there was something nagging at him, something telling him he couldn't walk away now. Not after everything. Not after the threat. The manager looked at him, his expression grim. "I'd be careful. This is about more than just your job now. If she's threatening you, or if she's trying to stir up more trouble, we need to handle this right." With a deep breath, the waiter opened the message. It was short and chilling. "I told you you'll regret this. You'll see." His phone slipped from his fingers, clattering against the desk as his mind raced. He didn't know what she meant. Was this a direct threat to his safety? Or was it about something else, something more dangerous, something bigger than he had ever anticipated? As he stared at the message, his thoughts swirled in a chaotic mess. This was no longer just about standing up for himself. It was no longer just about one woman and a moment of conflict. The stakes had changed. There was something more coming, something that would push him further, force him to confront not just the woman, but everything that had led to this moment. He had no idea how far she would go, or what the consequences would be. But one thing was certain: the tension wasn't over. It was only just beginning to crack open, and whatever happened next would change everything. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the waiter stood there, staring at his phone. The message from the woman still burned into his mind. He knew things were about to escalate. The manager was already on edge, his eyes constantly flicking to the phone, as if waiting for another bombshell to drop. But there was something unsettling about the whole situation. He had no idea how far she would push this, or how far he would be dragged into it. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't just a message, it was a call. He hesitated before answering, the tightness in his chest growing as he accepted the call. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Hello, is this the waiter from last night?" The voice asked, a smooth, calculated tone behind the words. It was the woman. His heart rate shot up, his grip tightening on the phone. "Yes, it's me. What do you want?" Her laugh on the other end sent chills down his spine. "You've been making a big mistake," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "You think I'm just some random customer? You really have no idea who I am, do you?" The waiter's mind raced. "I don't know who you are. But I do know I'm not afraid of you." The woman's voice turned cold, ice in every word. "That's where you're wrong. I'm not just some customer. I have connections. I can make sure you never work in this town again. You think you've won? I'm just getting started." His stomach dropped. It wasn't just about a bad review anymore. She was threatening everything. His job. His future. She was playing a dangerous game, and he was caught in the middle. Before he could respond, the woman hung up, leaving nothing but the sharp sound of the dial tone in his ear. He stared at the phone, his mind spinning. He needed to act. He needed to take control of the situation before it spiraled any further. He turned to the manager, his face pale. "She's not done. She said she has connections, and she's threatening to make sure I lose my job, my career. This is bigger than a review, it's a vendetta." The manager's expression hardened. "This is serious. We need to protect you. We can't let her ruin you. I'll contact the higher-ups, let them know what's happening, and if she tries anything further, we'll have the evidence we need." But just as he was about to pick up his phone to make a call, something unexpected happened. The door to the office swung open, and the woman walked in. The waiter and the manager froze, staring at her in disbelief. She didn't look like the angry customer from before. Instead, she was calm, collected, almost like she had been planning this all along. She looked right at the waiter, her eyes calculating, as if she was waiting for him to react. The room fell silent. The waiter's pulse raced in his ears. Was she here to follow through on her threats? Or was this something different entirely? "I'm done playing games," she said, her voice now surprisingly calm. "You think I was just going to leave things with a bad review? No, I don't work like that. I'm not some petty person looking for revenge. I wanted to test you." The waiter's confusion was palpable. "Test me? What are you talking about?" She sighed, almost as if she were tired of pretending. "I'm not just some random woman trying to hurt you. I've been watching you, observing how you handled things. You think I just left to cause trouble? No, I left because I wanted to see what you would do next. I wanted to see if you would back down, or if you'd stand up for yourself. I wanted to see if you'd let me walk all over you, or if you'd show me something more." The waiter's head was spinning. Was this some kind of sick game she was playing? Was she mocking him? "You put me through all of that, just to test me?" he asked, the disbelief clear in his voice. Her expression softened slightly. You passed the test. I wanted to see if you had the courage to fight back. I'm sorry for what I said before. It was wrong, and I shouldn't have done that. But I wasn't testing just you. I was testing myself, too. I had to see if I could let go of my own anger. And I think I've learned something. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension was still thick in the air, but something had shifted. The waiter was confused, unsure of how to process what had just happened. The woman had gone from being an enemy to what? An ally? Someone who had played a cruel game for her own reasons, only to end up admitting fault? The manager, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. So, what now? He asked, his voice cautious but curious. The woman looked between the two of them, her expression softening even more. I'm going to make things right. I'll retract the review, and I'll make sure this whole situation is put behind us. But I want you both to understand something. I didn't do this because I wanted to hurt you. I did it because I needed to face myself, to see if I could change. And maybe, just maybe, I've learned that it's time to start acting differently. The words hung in the air, as if the ground beneath them was shifting, and neither the waiter nor the manager knew exactly where it would lead. The woman who had been a villain in their story was now offering redemption, but was it real? Was she really changing, or was this just another tactic to manipulate the situation? The waiter's mind raced as he looked at her, trying to decide if he could trust her. Could he forgive her for the damage she had tried to cause, or would he always be haunted by the memory of her cruel words? Before he could say anything, she turned to leave, her heels clicking sharply on the floor as she walked toward the door. I'll leave you both to think about it, she said, pausing just before she exited. And remember, not every battle is what it seems. The door shut behind her with a quiet finality, and for the second time that night, the room seemed to exhale. But this time, there was no sense of relief. Only uncertainty. Had the woman truly changed? Or had she just completed another phase of her plan? The waiter and the manager exchanged glances, either one sure of what had just happened. One thing was clear: nothing in this story had been as simple as it seemed. The woman had tested him, manipulated him, and now, just when he thought the chapter was over, she left them with a final question: was this a new beginning, or was it just another layer of the game? Either of them knew. But as the night grew darker, both of them knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving an eerie silence that seemed to stretch endlessly through the small office. The waiter stood frozen, his thoughts swirling, trying to make sense of everything that had just unfolded. Was this a victory? A defeat? Or was it something else entirely, something more complicated than he could wrap his head around? The manager was still standing beside him, a look of disbelief painted on his face. He wasn't sure how to process the shift in the atmosphere. The woman had walked in like a storm, creating chaos and leaving just as suddenly. But now, with her departure, things didn't feel settled. The waiter's heart still raced, and the unease that had been building throughout the night hadn't fully dissipated. Do you think she's really changed? The manager asked, breaking the silence that had filled the room since the woman left. The waiter shook his head, still trying to piece together what had just happened. I don't know. I'm not sure if I should believe her. The manager let out a breath, clearly just as uncertain. We can't let our guard down. She's shown us just how far she's willing to go, and I'm not convinced that she's really finished. But maybe she means it. Maybe this is her way of trying to make amends. Whatever happens, we'll be ready. The words were meant to reassure the waiter, but they didn't have the desired effect. The situation felt unresolved. It was hard to shake the feeling that something still lingered, something they hadn't seen coming. But for now, the night had come to an end. The restaurant had closed, and the tension between the staff remained, but they couldn't keep thinking about it forever. They had to move on. As the days passed, the waiter tried to focus on his work. The woman's strange visit had been the talk of the restaurant, with the staff exchanging their thoughts and theories, but nothing concrete came of it. She hadn't returned. There were no more messages, no more threats. The review she had posted was still there, but it had started to fade in importance as time went on. Customers continued to come in, the restaurant carried on its usual rhythm, and life went on. But in the back of his mind, the waiter couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had been left unresolved. He had hoped that her apology, if it could even be called that, would bring closure. But it didn't. It only raised more questions. Why had she acted the way she had? What was the true nature of her game? It was only after a week of uneasy calm that the real twist came. The woman hadn't just gone away. She hadn't forgotten. One afternoon, just as the waiter was cleaning the counter, the manager called him into the office once again. His voice sounded different this time, strangely calm, almost relieved. The waiter followed him to the back of the restaurant, his heart racing in anticipation. As he entered the office, the manager was sitting at the desk, a calm smile on his face, a look of quiet satisfaction in his eyes. There was something about him that seemed more relaxed, more at peace than he had been in days. "I think we're finally through with all of this," the manager said, his tone surprisingly light. The woman just came in this time. She was different. She meant what she said. She made it clear that she was going to retract the review, and that she's moving on. "It's over." The waiter stood still, not quite sure how to respond. His mind raced. After all the threats, the tension, the back and forth, was it really over? Was it possible that this woman, who had caused so much chaos, was now just walking away? The manager continued, she was actually quite apologetic. "I wasn't expecting that, but she seemed sincere. And, well, she made it clear that she had no intention of continuing down this path. Whatever her reasons were for acting the way she did, it seems like she's decided to step away from it. And I think we can put this behind us." The waiter let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Relief washed over him, but it was mixed with confusion. He wasn't sure what to make of the situation. The woman's sudden shift from anger to remorse was jarring. Had she truly changed? Was she being honest this time? Before he could ask any more questions, the manager pulled up a fresh email on his phone and showed it to him. It was from the woman, officially retracting her review and issuing an apology for the way she had treated the waiter. The email also contained a small, unexpected admission: the woman had been struggling with personal issues that had clouded her judgment. She had been quick to lash out, using the incident as an outlet for her frustrations, but she regretted how it had unfolded. It wasn't an excuse, she wrote, but it was the truth. The waiter stared at the screen, trying to digest the words. He had never expected this. He thought it was all just a game of power play. But now, there was something different about it. Something human. Maybe people weren't always defined by their worst moments. Maybe everyone had a chance for redemption. "I didn't expect this," the waiter said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But I think I can accept it. I think I can move on." The manager smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "You did good. You stood your ground, you didn't let her intimidate you. You handled it all better than I thought you would. This is a lesson, not just for you, but for everyone in this restaurant. People can be unpredictable. They can be cruel and unfair. But in the end, it's how we handle things that makes the difference." The waiter nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He wasn't sure what to do with all the emotions that had been building inside him over the past week. But now, with everything seemingly resolved, he felt a sense of closure. He didn't need to hold on to the bitterness anymore. The woman had apologized, and that was enough. It was time to let go. As the days passed, the tension continued to fade. The woman's apology had done something that no confrontation could have. She had acknowledged her actions, and that was more than he had ever expected. The restaurant returned to its normal rhythm, the staff going about their work without the shadow of the woman hanging over them. The waiter still had moments of doubt, moments when he wondered if everything had truly been resolved. But those moments grew fewer with each passing day. The final unexpected twist came when the waiter received a package at his doorstep one morning. Inside was a small, handwritten note from the woman. It wasn't a grand gesture. There were no dramatic apologies, no grand statements of redemption. It was just a simple note, with words that carried weight. I'm sorry for everything. Thank you for showing me what I needed to learn. You don't need to forgive me, but I hope you can understand. The waiter folded the note carefully, the weight of it settling into his heart. He didn't know what the future held for either of them, but he understood something important now. This whole experience had been about more than just one bad moment. It had been about learning to move beyond conflict, to rise above anger, and to find peace with the past. And in that moment, he realized something else, that sometimes, the biggest victory wasn't winning the fight, but knowing when to let go. The sun shone brightly as he stepped outside, the weight of the past finally lifting from his shoulders. Whatever happened next, he was ready. He had faced something bigger than himself, and he had come through stronger. The world was full of surprises, and life was unpredictable. But now, he knew how to handle whatever came his way. And with that, the story came to an end, leaving him with a quiet sense of peace.